Hey everyone, and welcome. In today's Explainer, we are going to unpack one of the most dramatic economic paradigm shifts of the 20th century. I mean, just imagine an entire nation's economy flipping from almost absolute state control to a dynamic free market powerhouse all over a 50-year span. It's wild. So let's just jump right into this staggering tale of two eras. Here's a quick roadmap of where we're headed. We'll start with the early struggles right after independence, then look at the heavy state monopoly established in 1956, before hitting that massive 1991 paradigm shift. From there, we'll see how that shift completely unleashed private enterprise and drove a massive privatization push. All right, let's get into it. Section 1. Independence and Early Struggles. Establishing the baseline of an economy. To really grasp the magnitude of this shift, we've got to look at the incredibly fragile economy inherited back in the late 1940s. At the time of independence in 1947, the industrial scene was, well, it was extremely underdeveloped. There was a profound lack of basic infrastructure, and technical or managerial skills, they were practically non-existent. It's actually fascinating to realize that back then, a lack of government intervention was seen as the main problem. Because resources were so scarce, there was a huge national consensus that to achieve any kind of economic sovereignty, the state literally had to step in and take a very active interventionist role. So, looking at the timeline, the government first laid out its attitude toward private capital in 1948, but it was the Comprehensive Industrial Policy Resolution, or IPR, of 1956 that truly cemented the state's monopoly. And that incredibly rigid framework, it held tight for decades, all the way until the ultimate watershed moment hit in 1991. Moving to Section 2, the 1956 state monopoly, where the public sector firmly takes the wheel. Now, what's really interesting about this policy is how it literally carved up the entire economy into three strict schedules. Schedule A gave the state exclusive rights to 17 core industries. Think heavy machine building and things like that. Then Schedule B had 12 industries that were meant to be progressively state-owned over time. And Schedule C? Well, that was basically the leftovers for the private sector. The government completely claimed the commanding heights of the economy, while private enterprise was expected to display a very restricted, supportive role in the background. And to enforce this whole system, the government utilized the industrial license. You can think of it as the ultimate corporate hall pass. Under the 1951 Act, businesses couldn't just operate, they needed written, explicit permission specifying exactly what goods they could produce, exactly where their plant could be located, and, get this, exactly what their maximum production capacity was allowed to be. So it was truly an era defined by absolute top-down control. And it wasn't just licensing. Businesses faced strict capital controls, import and export controls, really rigid commodity pricing, and massive anti-monopoly laws like the MRTP Act of 1969. The state was basically looking over the shoulder of private businesses, monitoring virtually every single move they tried to make. Section 3, the 1991 paradigm shift, and what we might call the inciting incident. By the mid-1980s, reality really began to set in. This heavy reliance on the state was fundamentally stifling growth, and a massive shift was brewing. The contrast between these two eras is literally night and day. On one hand, the 1956 policy gave total primacy to the state, wrapping the whole economy in heavy red tape with a very inward-looking approach. But the 1991 new industrial policy completely flipped the script. It finally handed the keys back to the private sector, banking on market efficiency and export orientation to give a much-needed, massive boost to industrial development programs across the country. Now, this shift certainly didn't happen in a vacuum. Throughout the 1980s, various expert committees evaluating the economy kept arriving at the exact same stark conclusions. To accelerate growth, they realized India needed to increase imports. But to pay for those imports, it was absolutely essential to increase exports. And of course, to export successfully, Indian industries had to actually be globally competitive. So what did this all mean? The ultimate conclusion was that drastic, foundational changes in economic policies were completely unavoidable. Section 4, Unleashing Private Enterprise, a true overnight revolution. On July 24, 1991, the new industrial policy was officially announced, sparking what can really only be described as an overnight economic revolution. The scope of this policy was just breathtaking. It aggressively dismantled decades of suffocating red tape, actively unleashing the private sector. Instead of state control and restriction, the new focus was entirely on building up indigenous technological capabilities to meet world standards and just driving pure market efficiency. So the crucial point is that, in one fell swoop, industrial licensing was abolished for almost everything, save for a short list of 18 specific industries like defense and hazardous chemicals. Those growth-restricting threshold limits on company assets completely wiped out. And crucially, foreign direct investment, or FDI, was given automatic approval up to 51% in high-priority industries. The state deliberately stepped back into the role of a referee, allowing entrepreneurs to make quick decisions and seize business opportunities on their own terms. Which brings us to Section 5, the privatization push and realigning the state's role. So you might be wondering, what about the massive public sector that had been built up since 1956? Well, reforming the state's role wasn't just an afterthought. It was a built-in, mandatory ingredient of this entire reform program. Privatization simply means reducing the state's involvement in economic activities. By 1991, public sector undertakings, or PSUs as they're known, had increasingly become a dismal drain on the national economy. Budgetary deficits were soaring, leaving the government with little room to keep funding them, and the capital output ratio of these state-run units was alarmingly high. The government finally realized that by divesting their holdings, actual commercial logic could dictate business functioning rather than state mandates, and the expected gains from this push were huge. We're talking about improving economic and technical efficiency through profit-oriented decision-making, drastically reducing government interference, and promoting a highly competitive private sector culture. The public sector's role was strictly realigned and restricted mostly to essential, high-tech, and strategic infrastructure. Let's look at how this builds, because for the PSUs that did remain, simply surviving wasn't an option anymore. They had to face fierce new global competition. This required a rigorous three-pronged approach. First, implementing proper corporate governance to actually run enterprises in the interest of shareholders. Second, executing financial restructuring to fix broken debt-to-equity ratios. And third, engaging in deep business restructuring, meaning identifying core competencies, upgrading technology, and boldly hiving off businesses that were no longer attractive. Ultimately, the transformation from 1947 to 1991 proves that industrial policy is never static. It has to evolve with the needs of the nation. We watched a heavily protected state-run economy voluntarily dismantle its own monopoly to unleash the incredible power of private enterprise and competition. But as we look to the future of global development, I want to leave you with this thought. If the 1956 policy gave the state commanding heights and 1991 handed the keys to the private sector, what exactly is the perfect balance of state and market for the economy of tomorrow? Something to think about. Thanks for exploring this with me today.